basically domestic consensus. And North Koreans strongly believe that South Korea is a weak institute or weak entity because there's so much discrepancy, so much trouble, so much findings among Southerners. So, making a consensus among us in South is very important things. He emphasized, he doesn't describe how to do it, but that may be open to everybody to discuss how we're going to do it. As intellectual groups or policymakers or ordinary citizens, this is really, we have to think about this moment at a time. Our next presenter is Professor Choi, as I told you, is a new guy in Korean society, studied in America many years, and he suddenly appeared 혜성과 같이, so like a young stars. He teaches Yonsei University now. Dr. Choi, please.
Thank you, Chairman. As introduced, I try not to be a North Korean specialist, and I am not a North Korean specialist. I study and I teach international relations theory at Yonsei University. And when I was asked to present at this session, my first reaction was, sorry, I don't want to do this. But, they basically demand that there needs to be a sort of younger voice. But, I don't know what that means. Basically, throughout the paper, obviously my paper was not included in the program. I don't know the reason why not, but anyway. What I wanted to do is I will deductively sort of lay out things that we should do and we should not do. And basically, I like to lay out grand strategy or general ideas about nuclear weapons and succession politics and the future of North Korea, which I think is everything about, the world. I like to ask this. Basically, many people ask, what we should do in times of a crisis. But we need to reframe the question here because we seem to know many facts, but we don't know the details. So then we should, basically deductively lay out a logic. We know that North Korea is going through economic hardship. We also know that, since, I guess, their missile rocket testing and nuclear tests, their international status is really deteriorating, and they're sort of maximizing their isolation. And also, we know that we thought that Kim Jong-il's health was worsening, and also there is a looming large uncertainty in succession politics and strengthening power of military politics. This is sort of the general facts that we know. So with that, what kind of question can we ask in order to resolve the North Korean problem? I think there are 4 big ifs. The first one is, if North Korea, as many seem to argue and agree, is trying to secure its domestic power base so that Kim's succession to his son is smooth and peaceful. And the second, if North Korea is trying to strike a better deal with the U.S. by going over the limit. The third, if North Korea is willing to bear any international pressure despite its harsh economic conditions. And the fourth and the last, if North Korea is showing the darn serious resolve to become a nuclear status, then what leverage do we have vis-a-vis this head-aching country that has been lingering for the last 20 years? Remind you that, this nuclear ordeal started in, approximately around, early 90s, and it is 2009. So essentially, I grew up with nuclear crisis. The training that I got, which was international relations theory, essentially literature presents several policy options, regardless of their feasibilities when we think about Northeast Asian security. The first one is this: wage a war, invade it, which is a very short-term, although a very painful, maybe inconceivable, but there's a layout on the menu. Let's invade this. Well, second option is to punish the region by, surgically striking the sites of the problem, so-called nuclear site. And third is sanction it, sort of impose economic sanction. The first 3 are essentially coercive strategy. And the last one is, obviously, I like to echo the constructive engagement. I guess I like to argue, by going over the feasibility of each strategy, and then I basically argue that the idea of coercion would be dangerously naive and practically infeasible and politically dangerous. the first one option is obviously full-scale war, and we had that. We had this in terms of Iraqi experience. Obviously, this waging a full-scale war and winning it, and I'm sure that we will win against North Korea, would bring the complete end to the lingering security problems that North Korea has generated to the world, and we will achieve unification. However, the cost associated with such war is large, including unimaginable number of civilians, and also economic destruction. And the long-term benefits of waging a full-blown war and winning it will offset such costs. It will bring the Korean unification and may make the peninsula a zone of democracy and capitalism, and obviously nuclear-free. However, this option is strategically unrealistic and morally, I emphasize, morally sinful, therefore inconceivable. It's unrealistic because, as we all know, Seoul is like 40 miles south of the DMZ, and many people will die, and the U.S. DOD and the South Korean government essentially assess that we will have around minimum 5 million casualties, including many foreigners. And also, it is and also many hardliner seem to sort of trust and sort of argue the U.S. enforcement. But as Dr. Choi Gang essentially argued, the U.S. cannot initiate such full-scale war because it is essentially thinly stretched at this juncture. It has a lot of problem in Middle East, so that this option is essentially out. Inconceivable, therefore does not deserve a single moment for consideration. And also, surgical military strike, it was essentially thought out during the 1994 crisis, and we all know that. What it does is it essentially surgically take out military and nuclear sites in sites that we know. However, destroying these facilities is one thing, but denuclearizing North Korea is another. In other words, the surgical strike will not achieve our final mission, because even if we do that, we still come up with many problems. For example, even if the U.S. successfully strike these sites, what about the nuclear sites unknown to us? What about the nuclear fallouts? What about the plutonium and highly enriched uranium that they hide? What about the nuclear devices that North Korea has already? And also, this option will only mean the end of the current turmoil and signal the beginning of the mid to full-scale conflicts on the peninsula. Therefore, I think that surgical strikes against North Korea will be unrealistic, dangerously naive, and productive at least. And the third course of option is essentially the economic sanction that we do right now. And but think about the policy design itself. The purpose of the economic sanction is to influence North Korea's behavior by inflicting pains. But where does pain go to? We have to think about it. The logic behind the policy is to strangle North Korea's economy, to weaken domestic political legitimacy of the regime, and to eventually force North Korea to concede to the U.S. and the world. This is a punitive action by the sanctioners with conviction that economic leverage will work. But essentially, as we all know, North Korea does not do much of trading with the United States and Japan. So I mean, obviously, this is they don't have much of economic leverage. And secondly, South Korea used to have a higher economic leverage on North Korea. However, as we all know, that economic leverage is decreasing. And even if our government sort of shuts down Kaesong Industrial Complex and shuts down everything, it will only aggravate the situations. Perhaps China is the only one that might have economic leverage over North Korea. However, I think that China, however angry China is, however pissed off China is, however betrayed China is, China has intrinsically two problems, even if it decides to do so. It is unlikely that China would stick to economic sanction at full scale until the North Korea concedes to the U.S. and South Korea, which would be quite long enough to cause regional economic problems in Manchuria. And also, at the end of the day, China wants stability around its border. So any policies that push North Korea to the limit, which will aggravate the situation and destabilize North Korea, that will, at the end of the day, sort of destabilize the region. So, logically speaking, it will be very difficult to respect sort of Chinese continuation and full-scale economic sanction. And also, I'd like to emphasize this. From the Iraqi case, we all know, sanctions does not weaken the regime in power. It only victimizes people. And also from North Korean domestic politics, which I don't know much about, the economic sanction will only be manipulated as a confirming evidence to the suffering North Koreans that the United States and outsider are actually the threats itself. So it's a confirming evidence to those people, which will essentially increase their cohesiveness of the region. So as briefly reviewed, the sad and sort of angry fact, the fact that really bothers us, the hardliner policy ranging from full and limited military actions to economic sanctions are, I guess, unrealistic and aggravating, and I emphasize unrelated to denuclearizations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that constructive engagement is better than the others, logically speaking. I mean, one has to justify why constructive engagement would yield better consequence near to achieving denuclearization mission. And obviously, it is really bad time to be sort of come out as, hey, I'm a constructive engagement supporter because, you know, as of the situation. But I believe that, you know, we'll come back to engagement policy. Whether we really hate North Korea, whether we really despise Kim Jong-il, at the end of the day, we'll sort of follow the Bush track. Bush track is meaning that, you know, Bush essentially coming near to the end of his tenure, he essentially aggressively pushed for, you know, what we know as engagement policy. Many argue the constructive engagement policy of the Kim Dae-jung, Clinton, and Roh Moo-hyun, and perhaps the last 3 years of the second Bush administration did not work, but only breathed North Korea's nuclear ambitions because it did not properly punish North Korea's crime. And also, they argue that engagement policy has spoiled the regime and it is time to teach some lessons. However, I think that all is good and they're all called for, and I think that they are legitimate to say it. Nonetheless, despite our anger and sense of betrayal and constructive engagement, I would like to argue is the only viable option left unless one stupidly considers military actions. Because what we learned from the last 10 years is this. North Korean system is essentially designed to withstand pressure. They are not built to sort of withstand friendly behavior from the outside because many things happen for the last 10 years. Critics of constructive engagement must know that it is not the engagement policy per se. I think that it is more of the duration of the engagement policy, which was too short. The conventional wisdom goes that North Korea enjoyed 10 years of constructive engagement from the South, and during that 10 years, North built up the nuclear arsenal. But remember this, North did not talk to the Kim Dae-jung administration for the first 2 years after its inauguration in 1998. And also remember that there was a naval skirmish between the two Koreas in 1990 and 2002. It was only year 2000 that the first Inter-Korea summit was held. Also remember, the Roh Moo-hyun government appointed special prosecution for illegal money transfer to the North in return for the 2000 summit in 2003. Therefore, you know, Kim Jong-il got pissed off and he didn't talk to Roh Moo-hyun for the first 3 years. Finally, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun had to deal with George Bush for 8 years, which means that constructive engagement was simply too short and unbearably bumpy and continuously inconsistent for the policy to implement any congruent changes within and from North Korea. But nevertheless, engagement policy by South Korea and another during the two liberal governments did bring visible and formidable changes within the North Korea. As we all know, July 2002, North Korea launched the economic reforms after the 2000 Inter-Korean Summit. What it meant was that it allowed North Koreans to test drive glimpse of the liberal economic mechanism and producing winners and losers of the reformers. The Kaesong Industrial Complex was monumental, in my opinion, because it sort of pushed back the Ford base, which was stationed in Kaesong Industrial Complex, and replaced it with 4,000 North Korean female workers. Basically, Kaesong City is now populated with, about less than 20,000 civilians there. And now I think that we hire about 5,000 to 10,000 labor workers. They multiplied it, 40,000, sorry, 40,000 workers, and multiply by that, 4, which is just average number of the household. Essentially, we feed Kaesong City. They expose the benefits of South Korean working environment, which is, I think, high-tech and top-notch. And Mountain Kumgang was essentially turned to be a leisure resort for what North Korea used to call as the class enemy of communism, which is South Korean middle class. They play golf and, they mountain hiking. Numerous reunions of separate families, NGOs, and private entrepreneurs networking with the North counterparts and cultural exchanges are nothing but normal trends decorating the optimistic future for North Korea. But what happened? The fundamental problem is that we failed to consistently support the reformer faction in Pyongyang. We did not deliver much needed support to the reformers in Pyongyang, who always had to craft each political maneuvers very carefully vis-a-vis the military and hardliners. In other words, reformers are minority in North Korea and take a great risk, including their own life, and we didn't back them up. What did we do? Sort of breakdown of the Kido, Washington's continuous verbal ridicules of North Korea, including, seeing North Korea as the tyranny of evils, outpost, loading Kim, and even saying Kim Jong-un is a pygmy and stuff like that. And freezing the North Korean financial assets in, Banco Delta after the September 2004 agreement. And Japan's fierce grip on the abduction issue are only a few examples. So thus, reformers in Pyongyang much have been marginalized, and hardliners came back to the center stage, and Kim Jong-il may not have much to support the reformers, as his own version of reform and open failed. In short, threat perception and betrayal increased. When the Lee Myung-bak government essentially reversed what he regarded as an ineffective and unconditional policy of engagement, what Pyongyang only had to do was to make fun of him, to ridicule him by personally dishonoring President Lee Myung-bak as anti-unification, puppet of the U.S. warmongers, and obviously, which I disagree, however, that's what he said, They said Lee Myung-bak is a fascist. But I hate North Korea, and I think that it is unfair to attribute everything to South Korea and the U.S. on and others. It was also North Korea's part to exaggerate its own threat perception, did not show much swift commitment to denuclearization, and played very large strategy in negotiation with the South and the U.S. But the case in point is that no matter whose fault it is, the current political environment in and around the Korean Peninsula has become the worst ever since the end of the Cold War. I think that from the security dilemma perspective, I think that we are essentially going into the spirals of conflicts, which really worries me. North Korea seems to be governed by the authorities conservatives. I have no data, but that's how I feel it. The fact that can be only inferred from North Korea version of the great leap forward movement, the mass campaigns such as the current 150-day battles, killing the weakly rooted, reform residuals. At the end of the day, but my prediction is that they will have to come out of the cave and engage with the rest of the world because its economy will fall down. And, I think that, Kim Jong-il's life is only shortening. If such is inevitable, the outside must signal its readiness to cooperate while signaling its resolve for denuclearization. The external pressure will only raise the threat perception in Pyongyang, and it will increase its regime cohesiveness and aggravate the current aggressive external behavior. Unless we can invade and win, unless we continue to sanction, and unless we afford at least another 20 years of North Korean nuclear venture, I think that the only rational and feasible option is to constructively engage North Korea. At the end of the day, I think that time is on our side, not on Kim Jong-il. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me give big applause. Thank you, Professor Choi. As other two, the former presenter, Professor Choi also emphasized the reasonableness of engagement theory, but there are some problems we have to consider carefully. two speakers already mentioned about timing, and mixed tools and means is important while we are involved in engagement approach to the North Korea. And we'll discuss that thing a little later, but thank you very much for your in-depth analysis and presentation. And after Lee Myung-bak government launched 2 years ago, and I've heard the criticism for past 10 years. Many people say lost 10 years regarding inter-Korean relationship and policy toward North Korea, but Professor Choi very cleverly explained the reasons why that thing happened, what's the problem to simply evaluate that way, and we can just discuss it later. And some person may have different views in this sense. So I will just turn over the mic to my dear friend, Mr. Klitsch. He has been in Pyongyang for 12 more times. How many times exactly have you been in Pyongyang?
I don't know. I don't count it anymore.
Okay. You don't count it. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me express my thanks and gratitude to the Jeju Peace Institute for inviting me to this, at the end of the of this conference, I can say really challenging and inspiring event. It's a great honor to participate in this panel about the DPRK and to speak to such a distinguished audience. Due to limited time, and I notice that I have more time than I expected, I try to be very brief anyway. My remarks will, as the chairman just has mentioned, will be more or less based on my own experience from more than 10 visits, 12 visits, 14 visits to Pyongyang in the last 2 years. So I'm trying to approach the topic from a different perspective, a little bit more from the perspective from the north. Generally speaking, I think that our judgment and our discussion is too much driven, not the discussion here, the discussion in general, is too much driven by the media, which always raises the same questions. And thanks to Professor Che, he has raised some more questions. We have to find answers to it. And keeps on speculating on the question of succession. What I'm missing in the whole discussion is a comprehensive analysis about our own strengths, our own weaknesses, and our own opportunities. We know about the threats, but the analysis does not end with the threat perception. So what are the real challenges we are facing? Let me try to put myself in the shoes of the so-called relevant forces in North Korea, which not necessarily represent my opinion, but my experience from North Korea. And let us have a closer look at what their intentions and their perceptions of the world are. What is the reason for the tests? What is the reason for leaving the six-party talks? To me, there is no single explanation of why North Korea threatens the international community in this way. To understand their behavior, we need to develop a comprehensive picture of the external and internal factors that motivate them. It is only by understanding the North Koreans' view of the world that we can develop a strategy to deal with the situation. Let me stress a few points. I'm sure that you could add even more. First point, North Korea wants to improve its bargaining power. The discussion on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula seems to be a never-ending story. From the period between 1994 and today, we can nevertheless, I think, reason by analogy. There were times of progress and times of when the situation froze or moved backwards. We had similar experiences in Europe and in Germany as well. Trial and error seems to be always part of such complicated issues. What lessons can we learn now from 15 years of negotiations? And I think it's time that we try to analyze these 15 years very consequently and deeply. Following the 1994 Framework Agreement, the United States negotiated bilaterally with the DPRK and experimented with the four-party talks without success. At the same time, North-South relations were also at a stalemate. It was not until 1999, this has already been mentioned, 1 year into the Kim Dae-jung administration and as the Clinton administration speeded up its North Korea policy following the conclusion of the Perry report that the North announced a self-imposed moratorium on missile testing. In response, the US administration eased some trade and travel sanctions. In August 2003, the DPRK agreed to participate in the six-party talks after it had withdrawn from the Non-Proliferation Treaty earlier in the year. After the first nuclear test in October 2006, the talks were interrupted and resumed on February 13, 2007. Often a start and stop process, the talks collapsed this year after the Security Council issued a presidential statement condemning the DPRK's launch of a missile. Then came the second nuclear test. I was able to witness, because on that day I was in Pyongyang, test on May 25th, 2009. It was a strange atmosphere this day in Pyongyang. So far the facts about the negotiations, very briefly. Asians, this is my experience, are well known for their negotiation skills. The word compromise has somehow a negative connotation. Compromising is very often perceived as weakness. For North Koreans, and this is one quote, it would have been a sign of weakness to release the two American journalists immediately. They have made it a political principle only to negotiate from a strong position. They always take a tough stance when the other party shows weakness. Moreover, and this is one point I was missing in the whole discussion in the last 2 days, one point we have to be aware of is the fact that in any concessions made by North Korea, the possible effect on domestic stability always has top priority. And this is the situation, this describes part of the situation North Korea is in at the moment. When the US freed Iraq from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein in 2003, North Korea realized that the US would not want to become embroiled in another major conflict or confrontation. They knew that the US administration would have to compromise with them and that they had the upper hand. When President Bush announced his resolve to solve the nuclear issue in North Korea before the end of his term, Pyongyang knew, of course, that it would be able to extract concessions from the US. Washington announced that in the context of resolving pending bilateral issues and moving toward full diplomatic relations, it would begin the process of removing the DPRK from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Before resuming the talks, North Korea also insisted on receiving assistance to solve its energy problem. The DPRK declared that it would not return to nuclear negotiations until the Banco Delta Asia matter was resolved. Finally, the US had to give in because they found themselves in a weak position after Bush had made his ambitious goal public. North Korea itself disclosed how important it was for the regime to have access to foreign currency. This has become even more essential after China became a member of the World Trade of the WTO, and dual pricing practices have not been allowed anymore. North Korea has been paying world market prices for every import in especially fuel, and half of North Korean fuel comes from China, has paid market prices to China as well. The conditions for only a few trade-offs are known. For example, the trade-off rice for coal. The very important point when we talk about sanctions when it comes to North Korea. So once more, the conditions for trade-offs are not well known. Very important, because when you want to execute sanctions, you have to be aware that not everything is paid in cash. Secondly, North Korea wants bilateral negotiations with the United States of America and wants to attract increased attention from the new US administration. We know that the DPRK never favored the six-party talks. Their objective was and still is to have bilateral relations not only with the United States, but with all the other parties as well. To a certain extent, coordinated approach of the 5 negotiation partners is weakening North Korea's position, and they know it. The closer the 5 are, the fewer options North Korea has. The strategic goal of Pyongyang is therefore to keep all of its options open as long as possible and to participate in these talks as long as it can get something out of it. When they call for bilateral talks, we should always be aware that their foremost intention is to enforce a policy of divide et impera. The testing of missiles and walking away from the negotiation table does not provide the confidence building necessary to forge better diplomatic relations. It is rather the opposite. Imposing threats is not serving North Korea's own political objectives. I'm sure that the relevant forces in the DPRK are aware of the fact that their actions are backfiring in this respect because it creates a common response from China, Russia, South Korea, Japan, and the United States. From the perspective of moderate North Koreans, and I repeat, moderate North Koreans, Juche is more than just an economic principle. It also plays an important role in foreign policy. It has always stood as the opposite of Sade Juoi, the principle, the Koreans know it, the principle of paying respect to big countries. Juche dictates North Korea's attitude towards the world by providing a man-centered outlook. Unlike Marxism, which gives explanatory importance to material production and socio-economic relations, Juche emphasizes the primacy of man. It is man alone who has a capacity to transform both nature and society, the material and the ideal. North Korea's Weltanschauung, meaning their perception of the world, according to the dictates of Juche, is thus to maintain the independence of the state and thus of the people. This probably is one of the reasons of the cooling down in the Chinese-North Korean relationship, which, by the way, is no more a relationship of lips and teeth. Obviously, China has lost some influence on the DPRK. Also, it is by far, and the numbers have been mentioned, by far its biggest trading partner, and they have annually been shipping more or less the same amount of rice and fuel to North Korea for the last 5 years. Of course, North Korea fears that the United States and China might come to an agreement over its head, signaling the demise of the swing policy it has practiced up until now. Certainly, North Korea wants to influence public opinion in South Korea. So whenever I'm in North Korea, they always ask me, how stable is the situation in South Korea? I still remember one incident in Pyongyang in October 2007 in the lobby of Korea Hotel. I accidentally met one official of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the DPRK. I knew him from my previous trips. In a brief conversation, he all of a sudden asked me what I, as a foreigner, would say about the outcome of the upcoming presidential elections in South Korea. I predicted that, from my point of view, Lee Myung-bak would be elected by a landslide. The guy immediately got out of control and rapidly screamed at me that I was too much